This is Unsung History, the podcast where we discuss people and events in American history that haven't always received a lot of attention. I'm your host, Kelly Therese Pollock. I'll start each episode with a brief introduction to the topic, and then talk to someone who knows a lot more than I do. Be sure to subscribe to Unsung History on your favorite podcasting app so you never miss an episode. And please, tell your friends, family, neighbors, colleagues, maybe even strangers to listen to. On May 6th, 1935, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 7034, which created the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, coming out of the Relief Appropriation Act of 1935, which he had signed into law just under a month earlier. Of the nearly $5 billion allocated by the act, $27 million was approved for Federal Project Number 1, which would employ artists, musicians, actors, and writers, with the understanding that, as Secretary of Commerce Harry Hopkins quipped, quote, "Hell, they've got to eat just like other people," unquote. Like all WPA projects, the idea was not just to provide relief, but rather to provide jobs and income to the unemployed. Federal Project Number 1, sometimes called Federal 1, was divided into 5 separate projects: the Federal Art Project, the Federal Music Project, the Federal Theater Project, the Federal Writers Project, and the Historical Record Survey. And at least in theory, these 5 projects were to operate without racial, ethnic, religious, or political discrimination. A few months after the creation of the WPA, Harry Hopkins tapped Hallie Flanagan to lead the Federal Theater Project. Hopkins had known Flanagan at Grinnell College in Iowa, where she was a member of the literary and dramatic clubs. Flanagan later studied in George Baker's Workshop 47 dramatic production studio in Cambridge, Massachusetts. After completing her MA at Radcliffe College, Flanagan taught at Vassar and then became the first woman awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, which she used to travel Europe for over a year, studying modern theater there before returning to Vassar. That research became the basis for her book, Shifting Scenes of the Modern European Theater. In Flanagan's instructions for the FTP in 1935, she noted the goal of employing actors, directors, playwrights, and stage technicians, but also stated a loftier aim. Quote, "The far-reaching purpose is the establishment of theaters so vital to community life that they will continue to function after the program of this federal project is completed," unquote. Flanagan established 5 regional centers: New York, Northeast, headquartered in Boston, Midwest, headquartered in Chicago, West, headquartered in Los Angeles, and South, headquartered in New Orleans. Because the goal was to employ people who had previously been professional theater employees, not every state had sufficient theater professionals to support the program. Within a year, over 12,000 men and women worked for the FTP, earning just over half of what they would have at Actors Equity Association minimums. They rehearsed 4 hours a day and performed 6 days a week. The Federal Theater Project's goal was to employ people in theater, not to make money. So many performances were put on free of charge to the audience. And when there was a charge for admission, the ticket price was generally much cheaper than at most professional productions. In its 4 years of existence, the FTP put on over 1,200 productions in 29 states, admission to 65% of which was free of charge. An estimated 1 in 4 Americans attended FTP performances over those 4 years. Some of the performances were smash hits. In 1936, the Federal Theater Project Negro Unit in Harlem put on an all-black production of Macbeth, directed by a 20-year-old Orson Welles. It was Orson's wife, Virginia, who conceived of the idea of setting the play in 19th century Haiti, with the play's witches turned into voodoo priestesses. The production, which came to be known as Voodoo Macbeth, was wildly successful, with 10,000 people trying to attend opening night in the 1,200-seat Lafayette Theater. After running for 10 weeks at the Lafayette, the play went on tour to FTP theaters in places like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Indianapolis. When local authorities in Cincinnati said that the audience at a production there would need to be segregated, the city was dropped from the tour itinerary. Video of scenes from the play can be found on YouTube. The Federal Theater Project achieved its goals. Using only a small fraction of the total WPA budget, it employed theater professionals, entertained audiences, some 2/3 of whom had never attended theater before, and helped launch the careers of people like Welles, playwright Arthur Miller, and actor John Houseman. Despite its success and its relatively small budget, the Federal Theater Project was controversial, both for its supposed communist affiliations and because of the perception the theater wasn't worthy of receiving federal tax dollars. According to Flanagan's stepdaughter, a congressman at the time jeered, quote, "Culture, what the hell? Let him have a pick and shovel," unquote. On December 6th, 1938, the recently formed House Un-American Activities Committee, sometimes known as the Dies Committee after its chairman, Texan Martin Dies, called Flanagan in to testify about the FTP. They were already suspicious that Flanagan may have communist connections, since she had made Russian friends on her European travels. After Flanagan admitted that some of the plays raised issues about social class, theater, after all, regularly questions the status quo, Dies, a precursor to Joseph McCarthy, asked Flanagan whether taxpayers should be forced to fund plays, quote, "that portray the interest of one class to the disadvantage of another class," unquote. 6 months later, on June 30th, 1939, Congress pulled the FTP's funding, abruptly putting out of work 8,000 people around the country. After organizing the FTP papers and publishing Arena, the Story of the Federal Theater, Flanagan went on to become head of the theater department at Smith College, where she remained until her retirement in 1952. About a month before the FTP was shut down, theater critic Brooks Atkinson wrote a long and sometimes critical piece about the FTP in the New York Times, concluding, quote, "Although the Federal Theater Project is far from perfect, it has kept an average of 10,000 people employed on work that has helped to lift the dead weight from the lives of millions of Americans. It has been the best friend the theater as an institution has ever had in this country. It has brought the theater and people together realistically. In short, it deserves to be rescued from partisan politics, which on the one hand are creeping into its administration, and on the other are threatening to put it out of business." Unquote. Joining me now to help us understand more about the Federal Theater Project is Dr. Paul Gagliardi, teaching associate professor at Marquette University and author of All Play and No Work: American Work Ideals and the Comic Plays of the Federal Theater Project.
When you hear your feet echo in the street, when it's late and it's raining, and you're thinking of the sleep you're going to lose. When you hang your hat in an empty flat and you're feeling so lonely, then you're getting those Broadway blues.
Hi, Paul. Thanks so much for joining me today.
It is a pleasure to be here. I'm super excited.
So I had never heard of the Federal Theater Project before I read your book. I thought I knew a lot about the New Deal and WPA, so I am super excited. I want to hear how you first came to know about the Federal Theater Project and started thinking about writing it and got launched on this project.
Well, that's a good question. I don't know when I first heard of the Federal Theater Project. I did my master's degree with an emphasis on theater, and I guess I had seen reference to it at some point. Never really put a lot of thought into it. And when I was in graduate school for my doctorate, I wanted to focus on film and very broad, like cultural interactions with the 1930s. And I had this mess of a project idea, and I found a reference to the Federal Theater Project, and I was like, oh, that's like some weird side point of history, and totally forgot about it. And my advisor eventually said, you know what, that might be the basis for a dissertation. And that is really, in my mind, where I came to understand it, or my genesis point. Yeah, totally accidental. I wish I could say like this is something I had been interested in for decades. It wasn't. It was a cross reference in some book, a throwaway line, and then what I discovered was this fascinating moment of American theater history and federal governmental history too.
So this project, of course, we have the text of the plays, and being a government project, I'm sure there's, relatively voluminous archives about the project. But in some ways, of course, the plays themselves are ephemeral, right? Like we can't go back and watch the theater presentations themselves. So could you talk a little bit about your approach to looking at these plays, to researching and analyzing what's going on, what we can sort of determine from what we do have about what the experience was?
It's a great question. I think my first approach was I knew there were archives at George Mason University in the Library of Congress. The materials, play scripts, programs, in some cases, reports that directors of individual projects had to send back to the central office in Washington, D.C. So that was a treasure trove. They are ephemeral in that, aside from the Orson Welles production of Macbeth in Harlem in, I think, 1937, I don't even think there's any film of any Federal Theater Project production. So like any good theater scholar, I'm looking at, what press reviews are in newspapers for local productions. I'm looking, in some cases, of oral histories. I'm looking at other histories written by other professors and the archival materials, especially the Library of Congress. You always go into it thinking, though, it's incomplete, right? Because a theater director is not going to say this production was terrible. Like they're going to promote how great the production was. In some cases, in these reports that were sent back to the main FTP office in DC, you'll get audience surveys that were sent out, I think, as people are walking out of the theater. And it's funny, today I just got my teaching evals for the semester. So I keep the same thing in mind, like the people that feel the need to write responses usually have an axe to grind. So sometimes you get these very colorful interpretations of the plays. My favorite is there's a production in Omaha, Nebraska, And clearly, the theater director in this report to the FTP main office said, audience reaction just in giant capital letters, very favorable. So I often wonder about what actually they thought. So it's incomplete, right? And that's kind of, to me, the fascinating way of doing theater research is we're only getting a segment of what people thought about the play, little snippets and photo stills of productions. So a lot of our chemical materials, and then in my end, a lot of just filling in the blanks of what's not said by theater directors and audiences, and making admittedly some assumptions about how people are receiving these plays.
So you write a lot about the ways that these plays are talking about labor and work. And so I wonder if we could take a step back and talk a little bit about the goals of the New Deal programs in general. You know, in my mind, it's always like, oh, this is super progressive and we would never have nationalized anything nowadays. But, you know, it's not, for all that some people may have criticized it for being communist or socialist or something, it's not actually that progressive. So can you talk a little bit about kind of the overall goals of the New Deal and the way it's viewing things like work and labor?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. And certainly for me, when I was growing up and learning about history in high school, and then even through my undergraduate career, that's the reputation of the New Deal, is this progressive, almost socialist series of programs. But also, I think people often think of it as one centralized, unified vision from the mind of Franklin Roosevelt. And it's not that at all. It's a series of contradictory programs that in some ways are giving blanket amounts of cash to businesses. In other ways, they're trying to transform the agricultural industry. And over here, they're giving, electricity to the Tennessee Valley. It's not uniform. And you're right, it's not at all as socialist and communistic and progressive as it was. Some programs were, to be sure, but ultimately, I think Roosevelt's intention with the New Deal and his brain trust in his administration was, we have to restore capitalism. A lot of the influences for the New Deal come from the German Eberfield system in Germany in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, which was, in essence, you give money to the dispossessed and the unemployed, and work to those groups only as a way to kind of get them back into the labor force. The New Deal was, in my reading, and a lot of historians as well, very conservative, right? Roosevelt, in his speeches and his inaugural addresses, because he has 4 of them, says in essence, right, repeatedly, that work restores the mind and the body. And that's a very kind of old school American perspective of labor. Like, labor is how we fundamentally define ourselves. Interactions with society is, what work do you do? And for him, and I think a lot of the New Deal, it's restoring the worker to get them back into the marketplace. If you look at a lot of the policies of New Deal programs, they are very conservative, especially socially. The driving force of most New Deal programs is to restore the male as breadwinner ethos to American society. The Depression hits male workers especially bad, but also women workers. And yet most New Deal programs are, we need to privilege the unemployed male worker. That also extends to a lot of non-white groups. Most New Deal programs privilege white labor forces as opposed to black labor forces, especially in the South. And that's not to say there are things the New Deal is trying to rectify and modify capitalism in the 1930s. The National Recovery Act is, in essence, a sort of quasi-socialist or social democratic approach to fixing the economic and labor market. But that's kind of unusual for most of the New Deal. It's about pumping money into the economy, this very Keynesian approach to society, which we would read now as progressive, but in its root, it's fairly conservative.
It's probably a good moment to remind ourselves that people who work in theaters are labor. Like this is, it's easy to forget sometimes that art and labor are related, but this is these people's livelihood. They too were put out of work when theaters failed, when the economy was suffering. So let's start there before we talk about the plays themselves and what they say about labor, what it is that the Federal Theater Project itself is doing to help these people get back to work, what that work means for them.
Mhm. That's a great point. And it's funny that, not funny, but we came through in the last year the massive strikes in Hollywood. And every few years, we're reminded that theater work, film work, acting work is labor. One of the odd things about the FTP and why it was so controversial is we've always had in American society a kind of this very complicated relationship with viewing acting as labor. We have our roots in the Puritans and in New England and on the East Coast, who vehemently thought that acting was antithetical to labor. And we've often maintained that throughout American history, right? That the old adage that you often hear theater historians say is women that worked in theaters in the 19th century were thought of on the same social strata as prostitutes. Like this was something that was just antithetical to everything that was American. One of the things I argue in my book is by the 30s, that's starting to change. People start to see acting as both something that's very democratic and also something that is a form of leisure, right? You start to understand that our leisure activities are often built on some form of labor, whether you're going to a baseball game and seeing people playing baseball and engaging in work, or going to the theater or seeing it on screen on a movie screen. When the depression hits, it's really bad for theater. Huge percentages of theaters close across the country. Broadway barely stays afloat. In major cities like New York and Chicago and Philadelphia, theater does okay, but St. Louis, Milwaukee, Detroit, theaters are really hit hard. Amateur theaters across the country just don't have money to stay afloat. So one of the appeals for many theater workers was this is a lifeline from the federal government. And this is where I think the kind of radical notion of what the long view, the historiography of the New Deal partially comes from is you do have programs like the Federal Theater Project and Federal Arts Project that are giving federal dollars to avenues of labor that historically haven't been thought of as labor. And that's a very radical concept during the time. And for many theater workers, this is a fantastic idea, right? Like this is wonderful. But complicating that too is a lot of theater workers are uncomfortable with some of the art being produced by the Federal Theater Project. And I see a tension between someone who's trained on Broadway to do a very crowd pleasing sort of musical versus someone who's come up through the college or the university theater system, which is more avant-garde. And there's a kind of natural tension over what this labor should look like.
So how were the plays themselves chosen? Because you just mentioned that, there is a bit of a tension of like, is this the work we should be doing? There's a tension both among the theater owners and then later Congress asking like,
Yes.
why is this what we're funding? So could you talk some about what that process looks like to actually select the plays that were going to be produced?
It's complicated because originally, when the FTP is established, the guiding ethos from Harry Hopkins to Hallie Flanagan was free, adult, and uncensored. There's not going to be any sort of government censorship or government mandate as to what plays you can produce. Initially, I'm going to say the first couple years of the FTP is very decentralized, and it's the focus comes from the theaters themselves sort of organically. So theaters are set up regionally, or their districts set up regionally, and then individual theaters in individual cities. And so those theater directors are given a lot of leeway as to what plays they can pick. Many of them pick plays that they think are just going to play really well in that market, as theater directors do today. Other theater directors are doing something very, you know, in vogue and very, I mean, not in vogue, but very abstract or very avant-garde or very niche. I live in Milwaukee now, and the Milwaukee Federal Theater only lasted about a year because the theater director picked stuff that did not play in any way, shape, or form. And that also leads to these problems because sometimes these directors would pick plays that were very popular in the 1920s or very racist and very problematic. And Hallie Flanagan wanted something that was wanted theater that was challenging. She wanted to give theater directors the opportunity to pick plays that fit the marketplace where they were, but she also didn't want reactionary theater either. And so what starts to happen is there's more centralized control over what plays are cataloged and available for theaters to produce. In the archives, the Library of Congress, there are these amazing play reader reports. So people working for the FTP in DC would get plays. Plays would be suggested to them, and they would go through and read through the plays, offer their suggestions. As a cultural historian, this is like Shangri-La to me. I love this stuff so much. And then they'll approve those plays. Even then, there's still issues with those plays, especially with theater units that were focused on hiring Black workers. Portrayals of women sometimes are highly problematic in these plays. So to answer your question, it starts very decentralized and becomes more centralized as the FTP goes on.
You focus in your book on the comedies, or some of the comedies that are being produced. Could you talk a little bit about why you were looking specifically at comedies, and then you sort them into kind of genres of comedy? And so, how you sort of made those sortings and figured out how you wanted to look at these and analyze them.
Why comedy? Comedy has always been something that's been fascinating to me. And I think I've heard this said by guests on your show quite a lot. Like there's also like, this is the avenue I can research something. It was very startling to me that there wasn't a whole lot written about the comedies during this time. And I guess intellectually too, it was interesting because comedy is often the least discussed or kind of dismissed in critical and academic circles. It's always the lowest common denominator. There's what makes people laugh. I have 3 kids, and what makes my kids laugh is often the lowest common denominator. It's fart jokes. It's someone getting hit in the face with a baseball. And there's something to that. I'm not going to lie. Like the Three Stooges are still funny to me. So, I'm not being elitist about it, but there was something that I think for me, like these comedies were popular, and it's also, you often will come across this critique of comedy of the 1930s is all about just letting people forget about their troubles. And I think that's kind of dismissive in some ways, because it's true, to be absolutely sure. Like if I watch the Marx Brothers for 2 hours, I might forget about, my economic deprivation, right, in 1935. But to me, there was, what I started to see in reading these comedies was there was more there. I was very shocked at how many of these comedies were dealing with work, for instance, which just seems completely strange to me, right? That that comedy often is dismissive and incongruous to social, or it deals with social issues, but often engages in incongruous reactions for audiences. Like what you're expecting to happen doesn't happen. And yet, these weren't farces necessarily. These weren't slapstick narratives. They were often very realistic in their structure. And then being produced by the federal government, which is very concerned with getting people back to work. And here are these comedies that are offering like critiques of labor in a lot of ways. How I came to group them together was I just started to honestly see these patterns between these plays. Like there are a lot of plays focused on theatrical labor. There were a lot of plays focused on the ideas of chance. There were a lot of plays focused on middle class life, and there were a lot of plays focused on con artist comedies. And again, I wish I could say it was like some divine, like high labor on my part. It was just I started to see these patterns, and why these groups of plays became so popular in the 30s is really what I started to interrogate.
You mentioned that some of these plays, a fair number of them, are actually from the 20s, and they're reflecting, in some ways, maybe an earlier mindset or earlier thinking about both what's funny, but also views of labor, so before the market crashes. Could you talk about how that plays out when, these actors and these theater companies are taking what maybe comes from an earlier time and then making it work for an audience in the 30s?
That's part of what was so fascinating to me. Again, because a lot of these theaters are given some leeway as to what they can produce, their natural tendency is to go what was popular, right? There's a playwright whose work appears a lot in my book named George Kelly, who is kind of like one of the big major players of Broadway in the 1920s. And what's interesting is his plays in the 1920s tend to be read just as comedy and these goofy characters that aren't serious. There's not really a tragic element to them. And that's how, those plays are read by the press and typically audiences during that time. After the Depression, I guess the easiest way to say that is the classic Mel Brooks line, right? Tragedy is when I trip over a banana. I'm paraphrasing here. Tragedy is when I slip on a banana peel. Comedy is when you slip on a banana peel and fall into an open sewer and die. And yet it's once we start to realize, I think for audiences, or when audiences of the 30s start to realize that these characters, like in a play like The Show-Off, and The Show-Off is focused on this character named Audrey Piper, who is a braggart and kind of lazy and is fascinated with get-rich-quick schemes. In the 20s, that's funny. In the 30s, everyone's gone through the stock market crashes. They've gone through the inflation bubble bursting. They've gone through the creditors, and everything this character was kind of like satirical in the 20s becomes a tragic figure in the 30s. And he's not nearly as funny to Depression audiences. And actors and directors kind of play that up a little bit. There's a version of The Show-Off done by one of the black units of the FTP, and they changed the dialogue. They make him more central. I think it's a production in New York City, in Harlem. And there he kind of works as a figure of black culture, but also like he's more sympathetic in some ways, right? And you see that throughout these plays is a 1920s context. The characters are satirical and fun. We can make fun of them. In the 1930s, they're more sympathetic, and people recognize them through their own experiences.
I think it's interesting several times when you have like notes from the readers that you mentioned, the people choosing, would these be good plays and stuff, that they're often looking for things that are apolitical, but art is never apolitical.
Right,
And,
right.
even comedy, even slapstick comedy is not necessarily apolitical. So how did that play out? And was it different you mentioned there were regions in different parts of the country, or if it was like a black theater versus, a white theater, like was the political implication or the political reception of these things different?
Oh, for sure. And I wish I could summarize as quickly as I could, but it really depends on who's staging it, who the audience is, and where it's being produced. There's a play I'm very fond of. It's called A Moral Entertainment, and it centers on a theater troupe in Puritan New England who is starving, and they run afoul of a local Puritan magistrate. And in essence, like they're forced to give up acting or be, put in stocks or put to death in some cases. And I think that the play is very satirical, and I think it, in its own way, kind of goes to what I mentioned earlier, this sort of conflict over how theatrical labor operates and what kind of plays the FTP is doing, because the Puritans are all around us. Like, if we do stuff that's too political, the agency is going to be threatened. When it appears in Massachusetts, the audiences hate it because they don't see that comedy, that political argument. I think they just kind of see they're making fun of our Puritan heritage. And that's the thing that's hard about these plays, is once they go out into the ether, it's very hard to control, the content, so to speak. There are other plays, and I found this throughout my research, is a play in San Diego. California was very much a conservative hotbed in the 1930s. And audiences would either see a play as kind of reinforcing like conservative ideals, but there was also audiences that saw like, I think there's something going on here that we might be missing. It's all over the place, and it totally changes on context and where the play is being produced. A lot of black, we're called the Negro units, the black performers in plays that are aimed for black audiences. The same dynamic occurs where some audiences will see a play and see it being really subversive and really critical of white culture. Other black audiences would just see it as kind of reinforcing white stereotypes of black America. And that, to me, is what makes these plays incredibly fascinating. Is there's a debate among audiences as to what the political content of these plays are, because, again, as you said, oftentimes audiences also see them as just like comedies, right? They're just trying to make me laugh. But many audiences are very in tune to something else being said by these plays.
And then ultimately, the Federal Theater Project doesn't last that long. It's, I think, about 4 years. And, however much they tried to bring good into the country, however much they tried to be apolitical, eventually Congress says, whoa, what's going on here? So can you talk a little bit about the end, how this is eventually, just too much for the government to support?
The Federal Theater Project, in some ways, was always on a very short leash. Right. And I'm not sure in hindsight, and this is almost 100 years in hindsight, that it was ever necessarily going to work as it was structured. It was almost immediately a lightning rod of criticism. And some of that definitely is we don't want to pay for acting, right? The FTP is part of a group called Federal One, and there's, arts projects and writing projects. And I think those were more acceptable to people because they're tangible. Theater is ephemeral, right? If you don't see the play, you've missed the play, right? You've missed the labor. So there's always that tension to it. We don't want to pay for something that is only going to, adhere to the elites or people in big cities. So like the regional politics play into it. There's also, if we have the idea of the New Deal as communist and socialist, the FTP doesn't really help that, because there are a lot of plays that are very left-leaning, that are very socialist. Hallie Flanagan herself had gone to Europe in the 1920s and studied extensively in Russia, and really felt Russian theater was, American theater should adopt Russian theatrical techniques. A lot of plays were directed at the economic situation of the era. A lot of the plays did operate as sort of New Deal propaganda. They, promoted New Deal agencies overtly or subversively. So they become a very easy target for the Republican Party. They become a very easy target for the press. A headline is much more interesting if you say there is a play about beavers that is a parable for communism. There was, called Revolt of the Beavers. That plays better. You get more mileage out of that than here's a painting done by an artist in a post office in small town Wisconsin, right? So the FTP is always under attack. I feel bad for Hallie Flanagan because she has to deal with everyone underneath her kind of undermining her at all points, but also constantly being the target of political attacks and budgets being slashed and everything. So the writing was on the wall for the FTP. And there are congressional hearings in the 1939 where, they're calling out all these plays for being communist. There's a play I adore called Help Yourself, which centers on a guy walking into a bank without any banking training and working at the bank. And it's called out in congressional testimony as like, you're saying capitalism is bad. And when the 1940 budget comes, the Republicans have taken over the House in 38. It's going to be one of the programs cut. It's the easiest one to get rid of in some ways because it has been the target of so much criticism.
As a longtime theater lover and the parent of a theater lover, what could have been if they had just kept it going?
Yeah. And it's funny because like Hallie Flanagan is thinking about ways by the end of like what she would do differently. And yeah, you often think like, could the FTP exist today? And I'm very skeptical of it. I just don't think we have the political will to do that. But I do think it could work. I do think that if you took the lessons of, what the FTP did wrong, maybe, then I think you could have a national theater in the same vein and balance that what works in Peoria versus what works in New York City. I think it could happen. Is it going to happen? No, I'm not taking that bet in any way, shape, or form. But I guess to me, it's like this. It's a sad little moment in American theater history, but also like this pinnacle of American theater history too. Like this is the time we had it. We had federally subsidized theater that was doing radical things, even with their comedies. And it's only 4 years, but it was a hell of a 4 years.
So I would love if you tell listeners how they can get this exquisitely named book, All Play and No Work.
Well, thank you. That was my dissertation advisor title years ago, and it's perfect. And I hate him for it because it's so good. You can buy my book from Temple University Press or other online retailers. And I encourage people to try to get it through their local bookstore because we need to support local bookstores.
Is there anything else you wanted to make sure we talk about?
I think for me, and I guess this is something that keeps eating at me, for lack of a better word. I want us to also kind of just very broadly think about how we think of work. That work is not as sort of universal. Like we all come to work from different ways, and work is changing, and work has become in some ways far more consuming of us than even the 1930s in some regards. I guess that was part of the reason I wrote the book. In hindsight, was I want us to think about where work is going and how we celebrate work in its own way. I'm not encouraging people to become con artists or to gamble their financial security away, as several of the characters in the plays of this book do. But like we celebrate those folks in many regards. And I think there's a fine line between celebration of certain approaches to that and celebrating the more nefarious and dangerous elements to that. And also, like, I always think of this example from my youngest who said several months ago, I was taking him and the dog for a walk, and I said, we can't go out too long because I have to go back and work. And this was a Saturday. He's like, what do you mean? Why are you working? You don't work on Saturday. I said, I do work on Saturday. And I guess just I want to start a larger conversation about just where we place work in society and how work is going to have to change. And if we're not going to have a federal theater, maybe we should push for different conceptions of work. So that's my little radical, take on this.
I love it. Well, Paul, thank you so much. This was it was great fun to learn about the Federal Theater Project, and it's been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Kelly. I've loved the podcast for a long time, and this was a thrill. So thank you for having me on.
And when your cloud is lost, it's silver line, and the colors in your rainbow cease to
Thanks for listening to Unsung History. Please subscribe to Unsung History on your favorite podcasting app. You can find the sources used for this episode and a full episode transcript at unsunghistorypodcast.com. To the best of our knowledge, all audio and images used by Unsung History are in the public domain or are used with permission. You can find us on Twitter or Instagram at unsung__history or on Facebook at Unsung History Podcast. To contact us with questions, corrections, praise, or episode suggestions, please email kelly@unsunghistorypodcast.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate, review, and tell everyone you know. Bye!